This week, one of our main topics is poetry, and I have a series of several videos related to poetry that you're going to watch, and this is the first one, and this one is about including poetry in your elementary classroom. We're going to talk about some ways that you might have students work with poetry. So it's important to note that our instructions is certainly standards driven, and we use Common Core State Standards in Mississippi. And poetry is actually not specified in the writing strand of the Common Core State Standards. However, that doesn't mean that you should not have children write poetry just because the standards, as far as I've looked at them, don't specify that children have to write poetry. Certainly there are many other writing skills that are valuable to teach children and that you should teach children that you can apply to poetry. For example, it's really important that we teach students how to revise or improve their writing, and you can certainly help students acquire that skill of revision through having them write and revise their own poetry. So just because standards don't specify that students should write poetry doesn't mean that you should exclude it from your teaching of writing. However, Standard 10, which addresses that students should read a variety of text that increases in complexity as students move through the grade levels, specifies that beginning in first grade, students should start reading poetry. So poetry is specified in the standards in Standard 10 of the reading literature strand. But does that mean that we should not share poetry with children in kindergarten? Absolutely not. Poetry has a place for students at all grade levels. So these are just some ways that you might consider using poetry in your classroom, and I'm going to use the terminology from your textbook. So within your classroom, you might use a poetry book as the primary text that you're reading with your students in a literature focus unit. Remember, a literature focus unit is when the whole class reads the same book and discusses the book, and you teach mini lessons about it, kind of like what we did in our class with Al Capone Does My Shirts. You can certainly use poetry books for a literature focus unit. You can also use poetry books as literature circle selections. Like, in this class you've been reading and discussing literature in small groups online. Those are literature circles. Certainly poetry can, be incorporated in literature circles as well as in literature focus units. A lot of works of poetry are picture books that might not be appropriate for a literature focus unit or a literature circle. However, many popular novels and award-winning novels are actually works of poetry that are novel length. For example, this year's winner of the Newbery Medal is called The Crossover, and that's actually a novel that's told through a series of poems. And certainly a book like that is complex enough and robust enough for you to include as a literature circle selection or as a selection for a literature focus unit. So you shouldn't disregard poetry for those two patterns of practice. You can also integrate poetry into thematic units. Recall that thematic units are units of study in which you combine language arts and literacy instruction with content area instruction like science or social studies. For example, when I was a fourth grade teacher, we studied different regions of the United States and their landmarks and so forth. And when we got to study the Southwest region, we did a little bit of study on Texas and Texas history, like the Alamo. And I have this book that is pretty cool called Voices of the Alamo that you see the cover here. And it's actually a history of the Alamo told in voices of people who have lived there or lived around the Alamo throughout history. So it talks about indigenous peoples, hundreds of years ago. It also talks about modern visitors to the Alamo. So, sharing that book in my thematic unit, my social studies unit about the Southwest region was really helpful and helped the students really understand the history of the Alamo. And certainly when you are, teaching writing workshop, you could have students write poetry. We have students write different forms of writing. For example, sometimes we have them write narratives, other times we have them write creative short stories, works of fiction, other times we have them write reports about a real life phenomenon. We can also have students write poetry during writing workshops. So those are just some ways that you could include poetry. in your classroom within different patterns of practice. One activity that I really like that uses poetry is called the Great Poetry Race, and this idea actually comes from an article that was published in the Reading Teacher several years ago. It's volume 62, issue 7, if you want to look for it. As a USM student, we have institutional access to the Reading Teacher, so you can find this article in the USM library. So with the Great Poetry Race, what you do is have students select a poem. And when I did this in my class, I actually, gave students a packet of different poems that they could choose from. That's called bounded choice. So they could pick any poem they want of the ones that I pre-selected. So then the students have a certain amount of time to read the poem that they've selected to as many people as possible. You might give them 1 or 2 weeks to read the poem. And as people listen to the student recite the poem, what they do is they sign off that they've listened to the student read the poem, and the goal is to collect as many signatures as possible. So I really like this activity because, one, students are engaging with poetry and they're learning to appreciate poetry, but I also like this activity because it can help build their reading fluency. Reading fluency refers to the rate at which a person reads. You don't want to read too fast, you don't want to read too slow. It also refers to the expression or prosody that a person uses when he or she is reading. So having students recite the poem over and over again helps to build their reading fluency, and it also helps them become more self-confident. One year that I did this in my classroom, a student, who was a struggling reader and English language learner, won the Great Poetry Race out of the whole class. She collected more than 100 signatures because reading was hard for her, but she wanted to prove to herself that she could do it. So she really just took the bull by the horns, so to speak, and really wanted to win the Great Poetry Race, and she did, and she felt really proud of herself. It certainly built her confidence, which was really important for her as a struggling reader. So I just think it's a wonderful activity. It's really easy to implement. Really, as a teacher, all you do is select some poems for the students to choose, give them a collection page so they can get signatures, and explain it to them, and set them loose, and they'll do it. And I think that most students, at least in my experience, have really enjoyed this. And if you have students write poetry in your classroom, which I strongly recommend that you should, there are lots of ways that you can have students share and publish the poetry that they write. Certainly you can do traditional things like hang up their poems on a bulletin board, in the classroom or in a hallway. One thing that my school did was we created a class book of poems. Actually, my school did a school-wide book of poems. Every class in the school had its own page in this really big book of poetry. And by big book, I mean the page was probably like 2 feet tall. It was a really large book, and every, class in the school had a page, and every child had a poem on their class's page. So that was kind of a fun way of publishing poetry, and students loved looking back at books from previous years and seeing the poetry they wrote in earlier grade levels. But you could also do that on a smaller scale at the classroom level. Certainly create books of poems written by your students. Poetry cafes are really fun events that you might have your students do. A poetry cafe is when you have students write their own poetry and then recite it in front of an audience. So you might have students come up to the front of the classroom and recite their poetry. You could have parents and community members or the school principal or other classes come and listen to the students recite their poetry. And sometimes the teacher might serve light refreshments like tea and cookies at a poetry cafe, just to kind of give it a more fun feel. And poetry cafe events can be really exciting, and it's a great way to involve the community in your classroom. Certainly you could type up students' poems or have them type their own poems and post them to a class website or blog so they can be shared with other people. And there are also publications that actually accept children's poetry for publication. For example, there's a magazine called Stone Soup that regularly solicits poetry from children. So how cool would it be if one of your students submitted a poem and it was published in a magazine that's distributed to thousands of people? I think that that would be pretty great. So others include the Louisville Review, which I think is a newspaper, if I remember correctly, has a children's corner and they accept poetry. Muserology Cafe publishes children's stories online, and then there's also a contest called the Writer's Slate that students can enter in order to share their poetry. So those are just a handful of ways that you can include poetry in your elementary classroom, as well as ways that you can share students' poetry that they write. Certainly your textbook talks more about this, but if you have other ideas that you know of and want to share, please feel free to let us know.